What is going on, comic fam? It's your boy, the bearded comic bro, and I am joined by Eisner winner, writer, Jason Aaron. Welcome to the show.
How's it going? I thought I was the bearded comic bro. I didn't know there were two of us.
There's two of us, and I mean,
Wow.
you didn't trademark it when you started writing comics, so
Damn
I
it.
I swooped in, and it's mine now. But it's a club. We're all bearded
Cool.
brothers, so it's all
Yes.
good.
There's
um,
I feel like there's a lot of bearded comic bros out there. A lot of
yeah,
lot of bearded comic dudes I see.
it is. So it works out well, and I'm honored that you have a glorious beard that you have graced the show with it. So
Thanks. How could I say no to an invite from you? Like I felt
right?
like I had to.
It's the only time where my name Bearded Comic Girl actually worked in my favor.
It doesn't work in your favor in the just in daily life in
No.
general. No.
No. So, but because some people are like, I don't have a beard. Can I be on your show? I'm like, yes, you can. It's okay. But
Well, that's good.
you've written some of my favorite comics. I mean, I can run down your list of, Scalped and Southern Bastards and Thor and your Avengers run and just recently Once Upon a Time at the End of the World with Boom Studios, and now you're working at DC. Like, holy buckets, you have a just quite a collection of great comics that you've written. So thank you for talking about comics with me.
Sure.
One of
I mean, thanks for reading. I as I always say, I don't know how to do anything else, so I got to keep working this comic thing.
Well, it's working in your favor. So, one of the things I always like when I bring a guest on is to just kind of start with this. Have you always liked comics? Did you read comics growing up, or was this something that you kind of got into later in life?
Yeah, I learned how to read from comics, so I've been reading since I was a kid. The plucked copies off the spinner rack at the Son's grocery store in Jasper, Alabama, when I'd go there with my mom. I think that's where I first was there, or a drugstore. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Then found there's an old used bookstore. I think it's still there in Jasper, which is the little town. Oh, I grew up. Jasper was actually town. I grew up out in the backwoods, but there was a used bookstore there where it was the first time I found like comics that came from a comic book store. They would like some issues of Vigilante, the Alan Moore issues of Vigilante, maybe some Legion of Superheroes. I can't remember what all was there. So yeah, that's how I learned to read. Like I've never stopped reading comics. Started tracking down comic book stores and chasing, chasing them as they would move and close, and I'd go to another one. So I've had a comic book shop since I first discovered one when I was probably 14, 15.
Oh, that's fantastic. And one of the things I usually ask next is, what drew you into writing and creating comics? But in prepping for this interview, one of the things I like about doing these interviews is I've read a lot of your stuff, but you have a lot. So there are some that I hadn't gotten to
Sure.
read, and I was able to check out the other side
Oh, cool.
finally. And in the back, it was talking about how you have a cousin who kind of got into writing and wrote screenplay for Full Metal Jacket, and that's kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of what inspired you to get into pursuing writing.
Yeah, he was Gus, my cousin Gus Hasford. Yeah, was certainly a big influence. He was the first person I ever met who like made a living as a
Mhm.
writer. I only got to meet him like two or three times. He grew up in the same neck of the woods as me, but he had moved off by then, so only came back to visit a few times. But I mean, I don't remember, you know, exactly what it was that made me make that connection of going from loving to read comics to saying I want to do that. I remember saying I did say that like at a really young age. I think it just came from loving comics so much and then just starting to make my own. So I liked to draw a lot when I was a kid too. So I started to write and draw my own books, and just uh, drawing them on notebook paper and cutting them out and stapling them together. So I think it came from that. And then Gus was also a big influence as well. But I think it was just that spark of loving comics so much and like I want to make these myself. Unfortunately, I did that thing where I got to the age where I was embarrassed by those comics I'd made and I threw them away. I wish I still had them. Like
Yeah.
I'd, I got to hear Ray Bradbury give a speech one time, and his advice was basically don't throw anything away. So since then, I feel like I've embraced that, to cumbersome degrees.
Yeah. Mothers all across the world are happy hearing that because I'm like, Mom, just throw away this stuff. It's fine. She's like, no, I
No,
got to keep it.
right, exactly. Yeah, don't throw anything away. Like you never know when it might come in handy. So I wish I still had those horribly drawn comics I did when I was a kid, but I don't.
Yeah. So, you kind of were talking about there was at some point you're like, hey, I want to pursue this. And then, you kind of saw that there are people that can do this and make a career out of this. Um, you know, where was it in your journey then that, you got the other side, with Image, and then was Scalped, right? That you kind of worked on, or was there other stuff in between, or where was your journey with
Yeah, I mean,
writing?
I knew I wanted to write. I had no idea how one goes about breaking into comics, especially, growing up where I grew up. So I just kind of pursued writing however I could, through school. Anything I could do that involved writing, I was there. So I wrote, school newspaper, annual staff. Um, I went to college, got an English degree, so any kind of fiction writing class I could take, nonfiction stuff like writing. Graduated from college. I was like, of course, like, what do I do now? I had no idea, no plan. But I moved. I moved from Alabama to Kansas City. Um, got a job doing film reviews. I had a couple short stories published, so I was kind of always chasing writing in all avenues. Still had no clue how to do the comic part of it, but then in 2000, kind of not long after I'd moved here, Marvel did a talent search contest, kind of a national talent search contest that it was at San Diego Comic Con and Wizard World Chicago. And I back in those days, I went to Wizard World Chicago pretty much every year. So I entered and won. That was in 2001. So that was kind of my first break. It was a
Yeah.
10-page Wolverine story. That was like Wolverine came out in Wolverine 175. So that was the beginning of me getting my foot in the door in comics. And then the other side, which was first published by Vertigo, that would be 5 years later. So for 5 years I was kind of working incessantly, pitching things at Marvel, at everywhere. Then the other side came about, again heavily influenced by my cousin Gus and getting to meet his fellow combat correspondents. Got to go to a couple of their reunions. Wanted to do a Vietnam War book. And Marvel again kind of goes back to Marvel. Marvel under the crazy Bill Jemas days, um, like that talent search contest was his idea, and then he also announced that they were going to do a relaunch of Epic Comics, where anybody could submit a pitch for like a reworked version of different Marvel characters, which Tom Brevoort has talked about in his newsletter recently, and like what a disaster it was, and how the halls of Marvel were piled with submissions. Well, mine was one of them. Like you had to write the first issue script to submit, so I wrote up what it was a relaunch of the Nom. It's basically the same story as the
Yeah.
other side, but I wrote the script. It's was the first. All I'd written before was that 8-page Wolverine story, 8-10 page whatever it was. So this was the first like full script I'd ever written. Worked on it for months. Was super detailed, filled with kind of links and references and images, and so hardest I've ever worked on a script in my life. Um, and then Image or Epic never really materialized at all. And I did get like a rejection letter that said I was on the maybe pile for a bit, which of course, when you're grasping for any kind of encouragement you can get was
Yeah.
huge. So just kept plugging away and pitching and sent that script to Will Dennis at Vertigo, who edited most of my favorite books. over there, including all the Garth Ennis War Stories books, and kind of politely badgered Will until he read it and got it greenlit. And so that was my first gig at Vertigo, and yeah, that opened the door to Scalped, and after that there was kind of no looking back.
Yeah. And man, I'm glad you did. I I've loved a lot of your work, but one of the first things that I was exposed to and that I fell in love with was Scalped. And you know, I gotta ask, I know people want to talk about Marvel and want to talk about DC a little bit here, but I want to know, was when you were creating Scalp, did you have the vision? Because it ended up being what, 10 volumes, like that long, or were you just like, I'm gonna write until I hope that they'll let me continue writing it?
I mean, some of both. Like I
Yeah,
knew I had a plan. I knew I think I kind of always have an idea of what the ending is, like where things are headed. Like this is where this character starts and this is where they wind up, right? And I kind of knew um the clash it would come down to, and I don't want to say too much in case you haven't read
right.
Scalped. I encourage you to go out and do so. But I had an idea of where that was headed. I couldn't have told you exactly, well,
Right.
it's going to be 66 issues. I think I knew this is where things start. This is kind of where we're at when we get to the middle, and this is where the ending is. So as things went along and we got about halfway there, I think I knew, like, okay, I think it's going to be about 60 something issues. Um, but yeah, I think that I figured out pretty quickly you have to just write like you've got all the time in the world, right? Like you're doing the biggest book in comics. It would be unthinkable for you to get canceled.
Yeah.
Um, you just have to write with that kind of, I think, confidence. Otherwise, you can't do it, right? Like I don't know any other way to do. I don't know how to like do that and hedge your bets and think,
Yeah.
well, this is what I'll do if I get 12 issues, and well, if they give me more, then we'll do this. I think you just got to assume I'm going to get to tell the whole story,
Yeah.
and write like that. Otherwise, it's not. Nobody's going to connect with it. If you're not doing the best version of it,
Right.
people aren't going to connect with it, and you're never going to get any of that in the first place. So I always kind of wrote like that, and then thankfully, yeah, we got to tell the story the way we wanted to tell it. And I think we're kind of towards the tail end of the Vertigo days of where
Right.
in the heyday, kind of everybody who was doing it wanted to get that kind of 60, 70 issue run, and we were, I think, one of the last books to do that.
Yeah. So when it comes to writing for you, looking at yourself like The Other Side and Scalped and Southern Bastards and, even Thor or any of your Marvel run, what's a writing process for you? Like, is there a lot of research, like, looking at like Native American, reservations and, the casino aspect of that, or, looking at doing the research of a war book, or, so where does that writing process for you of like figuring out how to develop a story and give that, authentic backstory for it work?
Well, I mean, in terms of research, yeah, my first two books, The Other Side and Scalped, were very research heavy, right? I'm writing
Mhm.
about the Vietnam War, and I'm writing about a present day Native American reservation. I am neither Native American nor did I fight in the Vietnam War. So those were both a lot of me reading stuff, a lot of me talking to other people.
Okay.
Um, by the time I got offered something that involved I think the first one of the first work for hire things I did was a Friday the 13th book. I was like, yes, absolutely. Like I don't need to do any. I've watched all those movies. I don't need to do any research for this. This
Like it's
was
all here.
right. I mean, in terms of the writing process, to me, it always sort of starts with the characters. I mean, genre and characters, I guess, in terms of those. Like The Other Side, I knew I wanted to do a war book. I knew I wanted to tell a story that looked at the war from both perspectives. So we'd follow an American Marine, and we'd follow a guy who enlists in the North Vietnamese army and follow
Mm.
his journey south. So these two characters meet. And it's about who are those guys and where are they coming from and how are they alike, how are they different. Scalped is very much like, I wanted to do a crime book. This was the setting, and then who are these people, right? And who are these different characters? And I think I think those are the things people respond to with Scalp. It's not like daring and, in terms of its plot mechanics. Like, it's the kind of
Yeah.
story we've seen before where this guy's undercover, and he's undercover as himself, coming back to where he grew up. And it's a federal agent trying to bring down this sort of rising crime boss. We've seen a lot of different versions of that kind of story, right? So it's not breaking new ground in terms of that, but it's really about who are these people. So
Yeah.
with Scalped, to sort of drive that home, that the second arc or the second volume of that is really just lays out these are the characters. We do that thing where each issue focuses on a different character and you get their point of view and perspective. And because I knew it's like, if you don't, they're like, that's the selling point. That's what we hook people with is the authenticity and surprises of who these characters are. And somebody like Red Crow, who's ostensibly the bad guy, but also wanted you to pretty quickly feel like, oh, this there's something still kind of noble about this guy, and I understand where he's coming from. I like him. I root for him in situations, and he turns around and does something awful again. Um, so to me, it really kind of starts there. It usually starts with who are the characters. I think I'm a stronger character writer than I am necessarily like the guy who's gonna turn your head,
Yeah.
with plot shenanigans.
Well, it's interesting that you said that because I was talking to a buddy of mine and prepping for this interview, and he's like, volume two of Scalped is my favorite. And it makes
Cool.
sense then of, that's where you get into the character development, and that's something that you really shine in. So you have a gift for telling those characters and things like that. So is that a basis then for the start? Like, for example, something like when you were coming up with Thor, where you like, did you kind of come up with the idea of gore, then you wanted to like base the world around it? Is that how you do it with the character building?
Yeah, I mean, in Thor, again, there's like bigger questions and then smaller
Yeah.
specific questions, right? So some of it was like you have to answer the question of why. Why am I here, right? Why should you care? Like, what's interesting about this character and their world? So that was the bigger question for me. Was leaning into the idea of Thor being a god. That's what sets him apart from the other heroes and characters of the Marvel universe, and that's what opens the doorway to these different settings that is sort of the beat he walks, right, as a
Yeah.
hero. And that kind of led me to Gores being a villain who could speak to that. He has a specific gripe with gods. He sees them as terrible. Um, and he's also a villain whose fight could play out across a different eras, right? And
Yeah.
that leans into the idea of Thor as being so much older than the other Avengers and the other characters, right? So we get young Thor and old King Thor in the far future. There's also a little bit of my love of Robert E. Howard's Conan in there, and how Howard's stories, gave us this um, epic version of Conan's life by jumping around to different parts of it. So I knew I wanted to do Viking Thor and King Thor, which again are a kind of story you can't do with Spider-Man or with Captain America, right? Like, you can kind of only do with Thor. And then that all that bigger question kind of speaks to um, the specific character motivation is just this idea of worthiness, and young Thor is the one who's still striving for it, and present day Thor is the one who's achieved it, but still questions it every day, and that's very much his driving force. And then that's also kind of connected with his dad, his relationship with his father, which, I mean, to me, like those, Thor's relationship with Odin and that question of worthiness are like the two defining characteristics for him in whatever the story is, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's always the thing that motivates him. So I think you put all that together and show that, do a story that shows that. Don't assume, everybody comes to the table already understanding that or being invested in that. Because some of it I didn't understand. I wasn't really a Thor fan before I started writing Thor, so I had to figure out my way in and my connection. So it was all that, and then you have to put that, show your work, put that on the page in the form of a story, and say this is why this guy is cool and interesting, and this is how epic and grand his stories can be, and this is the places you can go to and the fun you can have. Um, like here it is, like
Yeah.
vomit it all onto the page. And then I kept doing kind of exploring those topics, for the next like what 6, 7 years, I guess.
Yeah. So I kind of jumped ahead into Thor a little bit with talking about gore. In your process, where did because you've spent a long time at Marvel. How I know you got your foot in the door by that, winning the Marvel contest, but then you were hanging out at DC Vertigo. How did you kind of make your way into the Marvel?
Um, I think it was again the stuff I was doing at Vertigo that kind of opened the door for me to come back to Marvel. I mean, I'd won the Marvel Talent Search contest and pitched a bunch of stuff, but nothing ever went anywhere. Um, but when I did, I kind of quickly figured out like I'm not just going to keep doing this, which I think is what a lot of people do when they're trying to break in. You're just sort of chasing,
Yeah.
you know, anything. Like you want to pitch for this, okay, like here one is. So anybody who kind of will give you the time of day, you're like, all right, well, I'm gonna whatever this person edits, I'm gonna go after. I kind of realized this is fruitless. I had kind of 5 years of that and really nothing to show
Yeah.
for it. So I thought, like I kind of specifically targeted Will Dennis at Vertigo as like, this is this guy who does books that I like to read. He's the only guy who was doing war books at the time. Like I'd feel like our sensibilities must be somewhat similar because I like so much of the stuff. So I pitched stuff to him. And then Axel Alonso was another version of that at Marvel, who's, the guy who'd been at Vertigo before Will. Will had taken over a lot of Axel's books, like 100 Bullets and
Mhm.
um, all the Garth Ennis stuff. So I sent copies of my stuff to Axel, and so he's very much the guy who kind of brought me back to Marvel and gave me, Wolverine and Ghost Rider and all the stuff I started doing then. So it was very much these are the editors who do the books I like to read. Stands to reason, if somebody's going to react to my stuff, it's probably those guys.
Yeah. And so like you were at Marvel for a long time. You were on contract with Marvel. And now, you're starting to, you had your Thor run and your Avengers run, and now you got stuff coming out here with DC, and in between that, you had well, it's still coming out, your Boom Studios book, Once Upon a Time at the End of the World. Is has When you're under a contract, like say with Marvel, is your process for writing different? Like when you're like, okay, I'm writing nonstop for Marvel books to now, like say, now that you're able to do, other books, is your day of like writing different than it was when you're exclusively with Marvel?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I
Okay.
think I think my process has kind of always been the same. I mean, some of it's just sort of I only know one way to do this, right? Like I
Yeah.
figured out the way. This is my process for doing this. That doesn't change if it's a creator-owned book, if it's a work-for-hire book, if it's a drama, an action story, a comedy, horror story, whatever. I kind of do it the same way, right? Like the process for me is the same. Now it might be easier if I'm writing my 99th issue of Thor than if I'm writing my first issue of Superman, but just because I got to still in the process of figuring my way in, but
Yeah.
the process is kind of the same and my level of investment is the same regardless of what it is. So I don't think that has changed at all. It's certainly developed as I've gone along and just as I've done it more and more and every week for the last 15 years. Um, but I think that's the same now as I'm doing DC stuff, really, as it was when I was doing Marvel stuff.
Do you have, when you part of your process, and do you have like a folder of ideas that you kind of like, here's something I want to utilize, or is it more like character ideas that you're like, this is a type of character driven story I'd like to tell and see if I can utilize it in create your own book or in like a, a Marvel book that you were working on, or how do you come about your ideas for creating?
I mean, the kind of all of the above, I guess.
Okay.
Like, yeah, I got, there's a lot of notebooks over here that are filled with ideas scratched in there. Some for specific characters, thoughts of like, hey, maybe I'd do this story with this character someday. Some of them, once I start thinking about like, okay, I have the chance to do a Batman book or tell a Superman story, then I'm focused just on that and writing out different ideas for that. And then create our own stuff. Like I'll have ideas that'll come out of the blue that'll think of and develop over the course of years and years before they finally come to fruition. The Goddamned was one of those. Like Once Upon a Time has been bouncing around in my head in different forms for a long time. And then sometimes things, you know, like you just sort of bring it into being when you need to, right?
Yeah.
There's kind of no set standard. I think for me, I've always just kind of gone like where my feet are at in the moment and like what feels right at this point in time. Um, and so again, sometimes that'll be something that I've been kicking around for years, and sometimes that'll be something I came up with yesterday. It's like what works for this
Yeah.
what I'm this opportunity that's come along or that I feel like I want to pursue, just like what feels right at this moment in time, and Thor's an example of that. And I wasn't jockeying for Thor. Never Thor was never something I thought to throw my hat in the ring for until suddenly I did. Suddenly I realized like, oh, I think this is what feels right at this point in time.
Yeah.
So kind of don't always know. I just sort of go. I mean, I've known for a long time, like, well, someday when I can do DC stuff, I'd like to do a Batman project, right? Like, I don't think that's a shocker, but I didn't necessarily know it would be, well, I want to send Batman into space, right? Until I got closer and sort of focused in on that as the thing I wanted to do first.
So you mentioned Batman, sending Batman into space, and reading DC, you see the ads for it, your first time working on Batman, in DC. Where was it where the point where you're like, you know what? I I want to send Batman to space, and this is the story I want to tell in Batman Off World.
I mean, I think once I realized like, okay, this is when my Marvel deal is up, and I'm not gonna renew it. Like it's gonna line up pretty good with me sort of finishing up existing commitments I
Yes.
had there, and open the door for me to sort of do whatever I want, wherever I want. Ben Abernathy, the Batman editor at DC, is one of the only guys who I've known kind of my whole time in comics, going back to those Vertigo days. He was at Wildstorm back in those
Oh,
days. He's the guy who did those Friday the 13th issues
oh,
for
nice. Yeah.
way back when. So he's someone that I'd always, sort of stayed off and on in touch with. He's a football guy, so we can talk football. So he's somebody that always reach out to me and like, hey, are you still exclusive? And eventually I could tell him like, well, I won't be after this date. And so we started talking about doing Batman stuff, and this was the first thing I'd sent him. I mean, I think I knew like I didn't want to do just what you would expect, like just Batman on the streets of
Yeah.
Gotham. I think I liked the idea of doing something that's different sort of Batman story than we've seen. And then there was, as I started thinking more about just my career and really my life as a comic book fan and a reader, kind of the pieces sort of fit together, and that DC books were really what got me into reading comics back in the early mid 80s. There was Marvel stuff there too, but for the most part, if you stacked them up, it was DC books. So when I looked at the books, like what were those books that made such a big initial impression? Some of them were like the Forgotten Gem called Atari Force, that was drawn by, at least those early issues of it, drawn by the great Jose Luis Garcia Lopez. That was the first #1 issue of a comic ever pulled off the spinner
Okay.
rack. So it was, every #1 issue is potentially somebody's like entry point or gateway drug. Well, that was mine. Um, so that book imprinted on me in a big way. It's a really great sci-fi, Star Warsy kind of DC comic, short-lived, and it's not available, and because the rights are all, I'm sure, a lot of red tape with the
Mhm.
Atari part of it, but
Yeah.
worth tracking down and dollar bins, if you can. So that book was big, and New Teen Titans was kind of the first comic where not only was I buying every issue, but I went back and started trying to find the ones I'd missed. And there was one of the first arcs I'd read was the arc where they go into space, where Starfire gets kidnapped by her evil sister, and you bring in the Omega Men, and they you know go into space to rescue her, and so that was kind of my first DC space story. So I looked at those. I looked at Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One. Those were fundamental, foundational, transformative books for me as a comic book fan. If you take all that stuff and mix it together, you basically get Batman Off-World. So
Yeah.
I wanted to do a story that was young Batman, young gritty Batman. This is the David Mazzucchelli Batman, the guy who's still on his own, still just kind of figuring his stuff out, finding his way, beating up mobsters in the alleyways of Gotham. And you take that guy and you plop him into the middle of faraway galaxy. Like, how does that go? One, why is he there in the first place? And once he gets there, his first thought is like, what am I doing here? I do not belong here. I have no clue what I'm doing. Um, like, I was interested in like that kind of story.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and then the Doug Mahnke was, literally the first name I mentioned when Ben and I started talking, because he's somebody I've been a fan of for years, wanted to work with for years, but he's always been at DC. I've always been in Marvel, so hey, now we're at the same place.
It's a beautiful
Um,
marriage.
yes, and I mean, I think he was the perfect choice because I mean, you can see just um, how he kills it every scene, just like the life and grittiness he brings to the setting and to all these different crazy alien races he's drawn. Some of the like I've referenced some like existing aliens that we seed in, but a lot of them are just coming straight out of Doug's imagination.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I couldn't be happier with that part of him.
Oh, it's been fantastic. I remember when I saw it, I'm like, Batman in space. I'm like, huh. But it makes sense with like you said, a year one kind of thing, because that would be the most Batman thing for Batman to do. I need to figure out how to deal with everything, which means there's aliens in this world. I've got to figure out how I can one up them. So I was like, it makes
Right.
sense to me.
Yeah, I mean there's a lot between like the guy who first puts on that costume in Batman Year One and starts fighting that fight, and the guy who's hanging out with Hawkman and Superman, right?
Right.
And like the Batman you get in Grant Morrison's JLA, the guy who's capable of fighting Martians and really taking down anybody he needs to. Like, how do you go from that guy to this guy? Then this Batman Offworld is the first big step,
Yeah.
on that journey from the Batman who's traveled the world to be everything he needs to be to defend Gotham. So suddenly he realized, oh crap, like I missed a step. There's a whole lot of stuff out there that I didn't get from, you know, fighting the League of Assassins and Ra's al
Right.
Ghul and everything he did. Like I got some more learning to do.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what sets him on motion in Batman Off World. But really, by the time we get to issue 3, this is a 6 issue story. By the time we get to issue 3, which I was just doing lettering corrections on today, his journey um, had changes. Like there's another development that happens. Like
Okay.
Batman is really being changed by what he's going through
Mm.
and by what he sees around him. And so that question of what does it really mean to him to be Batman? What is it about? That starts to change and develop in the midst of this, war torn landscape he finds himself in.
Yeah. So you've got right off the bat, you're going DC, you got Batman, and then you also got some work coming up in Action Comics. So you're going right onto the two big boys in DC right off the bat here.
Yeah, there was no like starting, with Blue Beetle or Blue Devil, which
Right.
also two of my favorite DC characters. But um, yeah, I knew I wanted to start with Batman, and then the Superman story was something that kind of popped up out of the blue, and that um, Paul Kaminsky, the Superman editor, he's doing this thing next year in the pages of Action Comics as Philip Kennedy Johnson was finishing his run, which has been absolutely incredible. If you haven't read
So good.
his run on Action Comics, I encourage you to go pick up the collections. It's been really phenomenal. It's made me a huge fan of all of his stuff. His run on Hulk right now with Nick Klein is really
Yep.
really
His
amazing too.
Green Lantern War Journal right now is
That's right. Yep.
yep,
Um,
so good.
and his he did
Yeah.
Aliens at Marvel, which was really good too. Um, before the Declan Shelby's doing it right now, and that's also awesome. Um, but anyway, Superman. Back to Superman. I lose track talking about
I do too.
good comics. Yeah, and so they're kind of bringing in different creative teams, to do sort of short arcs on Action Comics next year, and I asked me to be a part of it, and I'm the first one up. So yeah, come January, I'm doing 3 issues of Action Comics with John Timms. Three issues, but they're big. Each one is a 30-page issue.
Okay.
And kind of knew right away I wanted to do Bizarro. Don't know why. Like, I couldn't say I'd ever been walking around thinking, man, I want to write Bizarro someday. But when I was presented with the chance to write Superman under those circumstances, and like, well, you can use any villain you want. Um, I kind of right away thought, oh, I think I can do something interesting with Bizarro. Um, so it's a different kind of Bizarro story. I mean, it's Bizarro, so of course there's ridiculous elements,
Yeah.
but I kind of went back and read the Bizarro World stories from the 50s, which are really, ridiculous. They're just like, what is life like on the Bizarro World? So it's just how many zany ways can they do things backwards to how we do it. But as you read them, to me, there's something really heartbreaking about them. Like I kind of
Mm.
felt sorry for this guy, and then also wondered just how far could you push this? Can you push it into a realm where it's not really funny anymore, right? Where it
Yeah.
starts to be like, how dark and weird can you go with that? And so that's the story that I settled on. It's just, we get to see kind of, I think it's each of the 3 issues of this is really a very different story. So the first one is just Bizarro shows up and you get a colossal fight between Superman and between this, weird, crazy guy who's seemingly just as powerful as he is. And
Yeah.
Bizarro has also discovered this new ability that he has that we didn't know about. And he uses that to kind of strike at Superman and transform all of Metropolis. And then we're kind of off and running from there. So it goes to some really surprising places, I would say,
Yes.
with the Superman story. So I come in with a huge affinity and respect for Superman, which I don't think is a thing I always feel or say. I mean, I think I always have, you have to have respect um, for the lineage of these characters and how long they've been around and all the great creators that have come before you and that will come after you, right? As you
Yeah.
just sort of hold these characters for a bit and then pass them on. Like, do your best to tell good stories and then leave them leave them in good shape for the next folks. But Superman still feels different, Like I think just because of that character has always been a part of my life. Going back to I've still got my Superman Nightlight, from when I was still afraid of the dark. Um, so I think just part of me feels like, as a fan, as a reader, Superman has kind of always been there.
Mhm.
And as a creator, um, I think once you write Superman, it feels like, you've arrived. And so like you're not really a comic book writer until you get the chance to write Superman. So for me, finally, more than 20 years after I won that talent search contest, and like almost 17 years or so since I quit my last day job, 18. Um, Now I finally feel like a comic book writer. Come January, I will, once the issue's out.
Once you have it
Right.
out there.
Like I finally did it.
Yes.
Um, so yes, it's needless to say, huge thrill to get
Yeah.
the chance to write Superman for the first time.
I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I would say there's a lot of us that would probably say you've done pretty good as a comic book writer and you've arrived before it.
I've done okay. I've written hundreds. I don't even know how many, hundreds and hundreds of comics to this point. Right.
Right.
A few of them I feel like, were pretty good, but there's still I'm something that felt different.
I
Something that
love
felt
it.
different. And maybe I've written Spider-Man feels somewhat the same. I think maybe it's just that I've never written like a proper Spider-Man story.
Mm.
I guess I've written Spider-Man in things, and like one of my issues of Avengers versus X-Men, that was a Spider-Man story. It's one of my favorite things I've done. Um, but maybe I'd feel the same if I was sitting down to write, an issue of Amazing Spider-Man. I
Yeah.
think that would. I mean, definitely the first time I ever had to put words in the mouth of Spider-Man, that definitely felt, that was a weighty day.
Yeah.
Like I worked hours and hours on what I'm sure are very forgettable, like three very forgettable balloons
But
that just seemed very, felt important. It felt important not to screw it up.
yeah. Well, Jason, I feel like I could talk to you about comics forever, but I want to respect your time. So I got two last questions. First one, I feel remiss if I wouldn't ask, but do you have a character or someone that you say has the best beard in comics? Like I've never asked this to a creator, but I feel like having you on, I gotta say, like, who has the best beard in comics?
Let's say, like, you mean fictional beard?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
mean
yeah, yeah.
like, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like I have done my best to give a lot of characters beards over the course of my career. I mean, Thor had a pretty good beard.
Yes.
I gave Hulk a beard. Um, you never know. You might see Superman pop up with a beard in my story. Doctor Strange. Like I've done a lot of beards
Yeah.
over my years. But as terms of who has the best, um, I don't know. What is your thought? Do you have an answer to that?
So I'm biased. I have a favorite, but it's a very short-lived time, and it was from the Legends of Dark Knight run in the 90s, and I think it was Jose uh did it as well, did the art for it, but it was the arc where Bane fought Batman and it was called Venom. It was that arc,
Yeah.
and Batman took Venom so he could fight Bane, and he basically then went to the Batcave to detox, and he's down there forever, and he grows a beard, and there's a cover of it where he's just sitting in a chair in the Batcave on the cover with a beard and no
Sure.
mask on and no cowl on, and just I'm like, that's the coolest looking beard in my opinion, because I love Batman, but I was just like, man, that looks cool.
Sure. Bat beard.
Right. So
Sure. Yeah. Well, I will say, yeah, I mean, you can't go wrong with Batman. I feel like whenever Batman wants to grow a beard, it's going to be the best beard
there you go.
in the DC universe.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I will say, I feel like the times we've seen Superman with a beard, it's pretty awesome
It
beard.
looks
Like I
good.
remember maybe the first time, it was that big story when Superman went into space and kind of left Earth behind and went walkabout in space, where I feel
Yeah.
like he at least
And
had some
he's had some good
unshaven
ones.
look, right? I
He's had
feel like Superman really pulls that off well.
yeah. So, well, Jason, where and the last thing I just want to leave you with is a chance to what do you got coming up that we might not have talked about that you want to plug, or have we hit everything basically?
Well, the Batman Off-World #1 just came out, so that should still be in stores. Issue 2 comes out this month, December. Come January, like we talked about, Action Comics 1061 is my first issue. Also January, we'll see the return of Once Upon a Time at the End of the World, my Boom series, which the first 2 arcs of that are out. So the first trade is in stores now. You can buy that for yourself for Christmas. The second trade will be out in January, along with the first issue of the third and final arc. It's a 3-arc story. Each arc of that has been a different creative team, different chapter in the lives of these 2 specific characters who meet as kids in the post-apocalyptic wasteland, fall in love, and go on this crazy journey together that has its ups and downs and a whole lot of surprises.
Yeah.
It's one of the weirdest, hardest things I've ever written. It's one of the most deeply personal stories I've ever written, and I've talked about how it's kind of story I've had in my head for a long, long time that has changed and morphed as the years gone by, and very much
Mm.
grew out of the last few years of all of our lives, in particular my life. And so that's a book I've been really, really pouring my heart into, and I'm super, super proud of how it's all come out. Again, with 3 amazing different artists drawing these different arcs. We got Alexander Tafinki did the first one, Layla Del Duca did the second arc that just wrapped, and Nick Dragata's doing the third. And then as we get in this third arc, we have issues where all 3 art teams are working on the same issue, as these time periods weave together to to tell the story of these 2 people on their journey of love and ruin. So that's still coming out. That'll be back in January. Other than that, there's a lot of stuff to come. A lot of stuff I've written, am writing, will be writing for next year. There'll be some real surprises in there, I think.
All right.
There's a lot of different. I'm writing a lot of stuff for a lot of different places, and a lot of different characters that I've never written before. So a lot of surprising stuff to come. If you want to keep up with that, the best way, other than when I pop up on podcasts like yours, is I do a Substack newsletter. Maybe once a month or so. So you can sign up for that. I'm not too incredibly active on social media, but you can also you'll be seeing me have more opportunities to see me in person next year, as I'm starting to do more conventions. Kind of get back to that. I was just at LA Comic Con, which was great. I'll be at Planet Comic Con, which is the one here in Kansas City, early next year, and be popping up with some more. I think those haven't been announced yet, though. But
Cool.
so there's a chance I'll be coming to your town, wherever that is. Especially if you live somewhere cool. I like going cool places. So. And if I'm not coming to your town and you want me there, hit me up through my newsletter and let me know where I should go next. If you've got a tiki bar in your town, then I'm far more likely to. If you're in the proximity of a tiki bar and or a Disney theme park, chances are I'm going to wind up in your town.
All right.
Some point sooner or
so
later.
Columbus, Ohio is not high on your list then. All right. Note to self.
I've never been to Columbus. Have I? No. Maybe. So. Jesus, I can't remember all the places. Did there used to be a Third Eye Comics in Columbus?
It would have been before my time of collecting then, if there was. So
I mean, I've signed multiple times at the Third Eye in Annapolis, but I feel like maybe I have been to Columbus at some point. But I don't know. I should probably write that shit down. I've signed a lot of places over the years.
We'll have to get you out. So
sure.
Then so, well, Jason, thank you so much again for taking some time to talk about comics with me. And gang, go check out all the books that we've talked about, the stuff from DC that's out. is Boom Studio. Again, if you haven't read Once Upon a Time at the End of the World, we didn't get a chance to dig deep into it this podcast, but it's so good. Highly recommend checking out the first 2 arcs before the third comes out. But man, thank you so much for talking comics with me, Jason.
No problem. We didn't. I thought we would have just talked about beards the whole time.
Listen, we can do
We'll
that
save that for
sometime.
next
We can
time.
talk about our next time I'll have you on. We'll just talk about how we
Like beard
do
care.
beard maintenance. So
Right.
so
Cool.
all right,
Thanks for
gang.
having me.
Yep. With that being said, hopefully you can find some time to curl up, grab a book, and nerd out. Peace.